French food used to be the cuisine that most chefs, including those in America, used as a standard for cooking technique. And to give proper credit to this, we do still use a lot of the techniques that the French cuisine or French chefs perfected and categorized, like julienning, sautéing, braising, poaching, etc. Most American culinary schools today still focus on perfecting these French techniques, and most Michelin stars are still given to French restaurants serving French food. But today, French food isn't what's showing up on your Instagram feed, and the recipes aren't in high demand across the internet, and there aren't 3-hour lines outside of French restaurants. So how did French food go from king of the castle to the guillotine? First, let's take a look at the origins of what we think of when we think of French foods to help explain why it came and went as it did. Haute cuisine is typically traced back to Catherine de' Medici when she became Queen of France in 1547, and she brought along with her her Italian winemakers and chefs. At this time, the beginnings of the cooking style known today as grande cuisine or haute cuisine were only prepared for the nobility of France. These were the only group of people that could afford their own team of chefs and lavish banquets. For most others, you ate to survive. Typically, a palace meal had many courses in order to sample more of what the chef could do. They were heavily spiced, rich, very seasonal, or they were very preserved. Later, in the 17th century, French chefs made an active effort to distinguish what made French cuisine so French. What this meant is that a lot of international cooking styles and even some regional French styles were thrown out in order to create some standardization in the kitchen. In 1651, Le Cuisine Française was published, effectively removing those Italian influences from French cuisine. A chef named Marie-Antoine Carême helped popularize the use of fresh herbs and vegetables, as well as these simplified sauces. Essentially, things now had to be local and of the highest quality in order to be considered part of this haute cuisine. This wasn't a perfect effort, as there are still some very obviously Italian influences on French cuisine. Most notably, the artichoke is a plant that can only be grown in the Mediterranean, but it was domesticated and brought to Europe, so you will still see it in French dishes today. However, if something couldn't be grown or perfected in mainland France, it had to go. No more importing these fancy spices like ginger, cardamom, nutmeg, or cinnamon. Instead, the chefs focus on fresh and local herbs like parsley, thyme, bay leaf, and sage, and these limited ingredients meant that more emphasis was placed on the quality of those ingredients. Higher quality and therefore priced butter, fish, and meat now meant you had a better dish. With fewer ingredients, though, came more pressure on the chef. If you make a mistake early on in the cooking process, there's no way to cover up a chef's mistake, and therefore you also had to have a high amount of skill in order to perfect these dishes. And now you pair this expensive dish with more expensive wine and cheese, and you have the demand of some very rich people. And most importantly, you have a cooking style that truly tests a chef. Speaking of rich people, the people in charge in France just got kicked out. Some people had some things happen to them. When the French Revolution took the heads of all the nobility, this meant that now haute cuisine could be tried by anyone, anywhere. Well, not exactly. You still had to have a lot of money because the ingredients were so expensive, the chefs were still very highly trained and skilled, and there was still a small group of people in charge of what cuisine went to the public. This did cause another change in French cuisine, though. Besides what was considered haute changing hands, bistros and taverns were now more accessible to the general public. This meant that those tavern owners and those bistro owners had an incentive to make food that was able to make in large batches and served the general public's tastes. So it's more easily prepared than a small dish covered in gold leaf. Most notably, you have things like cassoulet, which is a meat and bean soup that became really famous during this time. However, so far we've only covered about 1/2, or some may say 1%, of what we consider French cuisine. Though we may think of croissants or hollandaise as the French cuisine, there were still those who couldn't read these techniques, didn't have access to them, and couldn't afford the professional chef or afford the ingredients that were part of this movement. Instead, now we come to regional French cuisine. So most French cuisine is considered to be regional to some extent. For example, champagne can only be grown in the Champagne region of France. The haute cuisine movement was centered mostly around Paris, so to some extent it could be considered Parisian cuisine. However, coq à vin is one of these great examples of a regional dish that involves braising the meat in cooking it slowly in a hot sealed pot. There isn't a lengthy preparation time or a precise way you need to cut everything in order to yield the best results. It even uses red wine as the braising liquid, which, considering that this is a dish in which you're not really experiencing the wine, it's likely a lower quality and therefore priced wine. While you could theoretically use higher quality ingredients to perfect this dish, the difference wouldn't be noticeable to an untrained palate, and as such, even when it was popularized by Julia Child in her cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, the ingredients were still accessible and cheap. Another one of these regional dishes that got a makeover, so to speak, is ratatouille. But not ratatouille from the movie with the cooking rats. Though the dish was slightly popularized by the movie's haute cuisine plating, the original dish features more slow cooking and rough chopping. I'm going to briefly mention that there is a history of French colonization outside of mainland France that has led to blended cuisine types, but colonization and food is its own video. However, the famous, trendy, and radical foods of today aren't made in France or necessarily use French techniques, and some studies claim that French food is the most overrated cuisine. So how does French food, that was once the standard for any chef, start to wane in popularity? What we just learned about French food being changed to be explicitly French and use the best of French ingredients used to be why French food was so popular in the first place. This created a unique cuisine that posed a challenge for any chef looking to test their capabilities. However, French food quickly becomes a tale of two cities, so to speak, two realities. I do believe that the first nail in the coffin was that fat-free craze that happened in the American 1980s and 1990s. So although a study in 2002 suggested that French people only eat about 36 more grams of fat than the average American, they still rely on a lot of butter, pork, cheese. So when you go into an American grocery store in the 1990s and you see fat-free on everything, fat becomes that bad macronutrient. You look at the food pyramid and you see, oh, you're supposed to eat a bunch of bread and use fat very, very sparingly. So that led to a lot of people seeing anything with high fat in it as bad. Nowadays, we see with the rise of fad diets like keto, carbs are now this bad guy macronutrient. So this doesn't explain why it isn't as popular today, though. But today, we live in an increasingly globalized world, thanks in part due to the internet. I can find a random dish on Wikipedia, and a search later I can find a recipe for it. So techniques that you used to have to go to culinary school for, now you can practice in your own kitchen. Dishes that you used to have to pay hundreds of dollars for, you can now make more easily at home. While there are some dishes that require a bit more practice and technique, the entire culinary history of the popular foods we see today isn't written to keep home chefs out. Not keeping home chefs out was part of the reason why French food took over the USA in the first part, mostly thanks to Julia Child in the 1960s, when her TV show made everyday housewives able to make these classy French dishes. But what this means for French food is that part of the mystery has been uncovered, and more people look upon things like haute cuisine as food that requires you to buy expensive butter in order to be good. On the other hand, we've seen an explosion of Asian and Latin food in popular culture, food that you can make in large batches with plenty of flavors. Street vendors, especially in Asia, are rewarded for culinary risk, which a lot of French chefs or French cuisine can't or doesn't make. Had French food leaned more into the regional and less into the haute, maybe we wouldn't have seen that original explosion of popularity or its waning. Another thing is that the US is becoming more and more of an influencer market. And given that the USA still has a lot of cultural pull, it's safe to say that the USA, what shows up on their plates, can sometimes trickle into the rest of the world. So what typically trends in terms of cuisine is usually what has caught the eye of the US, or more specifically influencers. A lot of it has to do with social media. More and more people want to take pictures of good-looking food, and more people want to try food that looks appealing. Viral foods typically look like foods like birria or tonkatsu, two food trends that I personally have also taken part of. Compare and contrast something like your viral ramen bowl with French food. Though the plating of French food certainly does give it some pull. With the ramen, we see variety, we see color, we see texture. We see that there's many different flavors. And with the haute cuisine, we mainly see one flavor, one texture, and sometimes you have this simple looking sauce as part of the appeal. Notice also that I mentioned a few times about how French techniques were once used as a standard and a test for professional chefs. Now, people in the US especially have less trust in institutions than previously. Everything from the federal government to the media is seen as less trustworthy, and people are becoming more and more aware of institutional and systemic gatekeeping that impacted the culinary world up until this point in time. The fact that French food was the kingpin of cuisine used to be part of its appeal, but now it's part of what's making its downfall appealing. There are also many French practices that have made it into the spotlight recently in a very negative way. Things that used to be delicacies are now seen as cruel and outdated. Orleans cooking is one especially. It was once a rite of passage for French gourmets to eat this bird, to cook and eat it. And now the practice of drowning a bird in brandy to eat it whole sounds simply cruel and gross. Foie gras manufacturers recently also have come under the gunfire for the practice of intentionally overfeeding geese until their livers become engorged and fatty. Veal even has declined in popularity as eating babies has grown less vogue. Now, this doesn't mean that French food is dead and gone and buried. If you walk into a bakery, you will see lots of French pastries, and you'll see a lot of Michelin stars awarded to French chefs. If you go to a brunch restaurant, you'll likely see poached eggs and hollandaise sauce and many other French techniques on the menu. For the average person, though, French food is no longer the standard. The world stage has opened up slots for lots of newcomers and lots of flavors, meaning haute cuisine has become the side dish of the culinary world, or the topping, rather than the main dish. And this doesn't mean that French food exists in a bubble that no techniques or cuisines use as inspiration. The development of Japanese Wagyu, which is now the most expensive beef in the world, is something that was directly influenced by Western cuisine. So there is a place for what is haute on our plates, but maybe not in the way that most would think. Thank you so much for watching. For this video, I made butter from scratch and then used that to make a hollandaise, then put up the pictures on Instagram. So if you like this video, you can subscribe to see more or follow me on Instagram or Twitter.